In the summer of 1841, the Grand Ashford Manor stood as a monument to Southern aristocracy, its white columns gleaming in the Louisiana sun like the bones of some ancient cathedral. But within those walls, a darkness was growing that would consume one of the most powerful families in the antebellum South, orchestrated by a woman whose very existence challenged every assumption about power, race, and revenge in the Old South. The Ashford family had built their empire on sugar and cotton, their wealth flowing like the Mississippi River that bordered their vast plantation. Master Edmund Ashford ruled over 3,000 acres and more than 400 souls, his word carrying the weight of law across a domain that stretched beyond the horizon. His wife, Lady Catherine Ashford, presided over the social elite of New Orleans society, her salon drawing the most influential minds and deepest pockets from across the region. But it was neither Edmund nor Catherine who truly controlled the fate of Ashford Manor. That power belonged to a woman whose name appeared in no official records, whose portrait hung in no gallery, yet whose influence permeated every corner of the great house like smoke from a fire that could never be extinguished. She was known only as Celeste, though even that name was whispered rather than spoken aloud. To the outside world, she was simply another piece of property, listed in the plantation ledgers alongside the livestock and farming equipment. But those who lived within the shadow of Ashford Manor knew the truth that polite society refused to acknowledge. Celeste was the true mistress of the house, and her relationship with Master Edmund had produced children whose existence threatened to unravel the carefully constructed facade of Southern gentility. The story that would destroy the Ashford family began 20 years earlier, when Edmund was still a young man learning to manage his father's estate. Celeste had arrived at the plantation as part of an inheritance from a deceased relative, her origins shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Some said she had been born in Haiti. Others claimed she was the daughter of a Creole aristocrat who had fallen from grace. What was certain was that she possessed an intelligence and education that set her apart from the other enslaved individuals on the plantation, speaking multiple languages and demonstrating knowledge of literature, mathematics, and the natural sciences that exceeded that of many white women of the era. The circumstances of Celeste's arrival at Ashford Manor were themselves shrouded in mystery and speculation. The official records indicated that she had been part of the estate of Edmund's great-uncle, Cornelius Ashford, a notorious eccentric who had spent decades traveling throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, accumulating wealth through ventures that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. When Cornelius died unexpectedly in Haiti in 1821, his possessions, including several dozen enslaved individuals, were shipped back to Louisiana to be distributed among his surviving relatives. Celeste was among this human cargo, but even from the beginning, it was clear that she was unlike the others. While most of the enslaved individuals from Cornelius's estate were field hands or domestic servants with limited education, Celeste arrived with a trunk full of books, papers, and personal effects that suggested a background far more complex than her legal status would indicate. She spoke French, Spanish, and English with equal fluency, and demonstrated familiarity with classical literature, advanced mathematics, and natural philosophy that would have been remarkable in any woman of the era, regardless of race. The mystery of Celeste's background was compounded by her physical appearance, which defied easy categorization within the rigid racial hierarchies of the antebellum South. Her skin was the color of café au lait, her features a harmonious blend of African, European, and perhaps Native American ancestry that created a beauty so striking that it seemed to transcend the artificial boundaries that society had constructed around race and status. Her hair fell in dark waves that caught the light like silk, and her eyes held an intelligence and depth that seemed to see through the pretenses and hypocrisies of the world around her. Edmund had been immediately captivated by Celeste's beauty and intellect, and what began as fascination had gradually evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. In the rigid social hierarchy of the antebellum South, relationships between white masters and enslaved women were common but rarely acknowledged, existing in a shadow world where power and desire intersected in ways that challenged the moral foundations of the society that permitted them. But Celeste was not content to remain in the shadows. Over the years, she had methodically positioned herself as an indispensable part of the Ashford household, using her intelligence and understanding of human nature to make herself invaluable to Edmund, while simultaneously gaining influence over other members of the family and the plantation's operations. She had become the keeper of secrets, the solver of problems, and the confidant who knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. The education that Celeste had somehow acquired before her arrival at Ashford Manor proved to be one of her most powerful weapons in the campaign she would eventually wage against the family that claimed to own her. Her knowledge of botany and chemistry, gained through years of study and experimentation, gave her an understanding of the natural world that far exceeded that of most trained physicians of the era. She knew which plants could heal and which could harm, which combinations of substances could produce specific effects, and how to administer them in ways that would avoid detection. Celeste's library, hidden away in a secret room beneath the slave quarters, contained volumes on subjects ranging from ancient Greek philosophy to modern European medicine. These books, many of them acquired through a network of free people of color and sympathetic whites who recognized her extraordinary intellect, provided her with knowledge that she would eventually use to devastating effect against her oppressors. The children that Celeste bore to Edmund were raised in a strange liminal space between slavery and freedom, their light skin and obvious paternity creating an uncomfortable reality that the family could neither fully acknowledge nor completely ignore. These children received education and privileges that were denied to other enslaved individuals on the plantation, but they remained legally property, their futures entirely dependent on their father's whims and the complex dynamics of a household built on contradictions. Gabriel, the eldest of Celeste's children, possessed his mother's intelligence and his father's commanding presence, creating a young man who seemed destined for leadership despite the circumstances of his birth. From an early age, Gabriel had been groomed by Celeste to understand the complexities of plantation management, the intricacies of Southern society, and the delicate balance of power that kept the system functioning. He learned to read not only books, but also people, developing an intuitive understanding of human nature that would serve him well in the years to come. Marie, Gabriel's younger sister, inherited her mother's beauty and grace, along with an intelligence that she learned to conceal behind a facade of feminine charm and deference. Celeste had taught her daughter the art of manipulation through apparent submission, showing her how to influence powerful men by making them believe that they were the ones in control. Marie's education included not only the traditional accomplishments expected of a Southern lady, but also the more practical skills of observation, analysis, and strategic thinking that would prove essential to her survival and success. The youngest of Celeste's children, a boy named Antoine, possessed a different kind of intelligence than his siblings, one that manifested itself in an almost supernatural ability to understand and predict the behavior of others. Even as a child, Antoine seemed to know things that he could not possibly have learned through conventional means, displaying an intuitive grasp of human psychology that both fascinated and disturbed those who encountered him. Lady Catherine Ashford had long been aware of her husband's relationship with Celeste, but she had chosen to maintain the fiction of ignorance that allowed Southern society to function despite its inherent hypocrisies. As long as the arrangement remained discreet and did not threaten her own position or that of her legitimate children, Catherine was willing to tolerate what she could not prevent. But as the years passed and Celeste's influence grew, the delicate balance that had maintained peace within the household began to shift in dangerous directions. Catherine's own background was not without its complications and contradictions. Born into a wealthy Creole family in New Orleans, she had been raised in a society where the lines between races were more fluid than in other parts of the South, where relationships between whites and people of color were more openly acknowledged, and where the rigid hierarchies of the plantation system were tempered by the cosmopolitan influences of a major port city. Despite her privileged upbringing, Catherine had always struggled with feelings of insecurity and inadequacy that stemmed from her awareness of her own limitations. She was intelligent enough to recognize Celeste's superior intellect and education, but she lacked the strength of character to confront the situation directly. Instead, she chose to retreat into a world of social obligations and charitable activities that allowed her to maintain her status while avoiding the uncomfortable realities of her domestic situation. The crisis that would ultimately destroy the Ashford family began in the spring of 1841, when Edmund's eldest legitimate son, William, returned from his studies at Harvard University with new ideas about slavery, society, and the moral obligations of the Southern aristocracy. William had been exposed to abolitionist thinking during his time in the North, and he had begun to question the foundations of the system that had provided his family with wealth and status. William's transformation during his years at Harvard had been gradual but profound. Initially, he had approached his studies with the casual confidence of a young man who had never questioned his place in the world or the system that had provided him with privilege and opportunity. But exposure to different ideas and different people had gradually opened his eyes to the moral contradictions and human costs of the society that had shaped him. The turning point in William's intellectual and moral development had come during his junior year, when he had befriended a young man named Frederick Douglass, who was traveling through New England giving speeches about his experiences as an enslaved person. Douglass's eloquence and intelligence had shattered William's preconceptions about the capabilities and humanity of enslaved people, forcing him to confront the reality that the system his family had built their fortune on was fundamentally unjust. William's return to Ashford Manor coincided with a period of increasing tension between the legitimate and illegitimate branches of the family. Celeste's children were approaching adulthood, and their ambiguous status was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The eldest, Gabriel, who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Edmund, had begun to chafe against the restrictions placed on his movements and activities, while his sister Marie had attracted the attention of several young white men in the area, creating a situation that threatened to expose the family's secrets to public scrutiny. The powder keg that was Ashford Manor finally exploded when William announced his intention to free all of the enslaved individuals on the plantation and convert the operation to a system of paid labor. This declaration sent shockwaves through the family and the surrounding community, threatening not only the Ashfords' economic foundation, but also their social standing and political influence. Edmund was torn between his son's moral arguments and the practical realities of maintaining his position in Southern society. Catherine was horrified by the prospect of financial ruin and social ostracism, while the extended family and business associates who depended on the plantation's continued profitability mobilized to prevent what they saw as a catastrophic betrayal of their shared interests. But it was Celeste who understood most clearly what William's proposal would mean for her and her children. Freedom granted by the whim of a young idealist could just as easily be revoked by changing circumstances or shifting political winds. True security could only come from eliminating the threats to her family's survival, and Celeste had spent 2 decades learning exactly how to neutralize those threats. The methods that Celeste employed to protect her position and her children were as subtle as they were effective. She had spent years studying the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of every member of the Ashford family, cataloging their fears, desires, and secrets with the patience and precision of a natural scientist. She knew which family members could be manipulated through flattery, which could be controlled through fear, and which represented threats that required more permanent solutions. Celeste's understanding of human psychology was remarkably sophisticated, reflecting not only her natural intelligence, but also years of careful observation and study. She had read extensively in the works of European philosophers and physicians who had written about the nature of human behavior and the relationship between mind and body. This knowledge, combined with her intimate familiarity with each member of the Ashford family, gave her an almost supernatural ability to predict and influence their actions. The network of allies and informants that Celeste had cultivated over the years extended far beyond the boundaries of Ashford Manor. She maintained relationships with free people of color in New Orleans, sympathetic whites who opposed slavery, and even some members of the enslaved community on neighboring plantations who shared her goals of resistance and liberation. These connections provided her with resources, information, and protection that were essential to the success of her campaign. Celeste's first target was Lady Catherine, whose opposition to any change in the plantation's operations made her the primary obstacle to William's reform plans. Catherine had always been susceptible to ailments and nervous conditions, and Celeste had long served as her informal medical advisor, preparing herbal remedies and tonics that helped manage her various complaints. It was a simple matter to adjust the composition of these preparations, introducing substances that would gradually undermine Catherine's health while appearing to provide relief from her symptoms. The decline in Catherine's health was so gradual and seemingly natural that no one suspected foul play. She began to suffer from increasing fatigue, digestive problems, and episodes of confusion that made it difficult for her to participate in the social and political activities that had once defined her life. As Catherine's influence waned, Celeste's position within the household grew stronger, and she began to take on responsibilities that had previously been reserved for the lady of the house. The substances that Celeste used to accomplish Catherine's gradual decline were derived from plants that grew wild in the Louisiana bayous, species that she had studied and experimented with for years. She knew exactly which compounds would produce the desired effects without leaving obvious traces, and she understood how to administer them in doses that would accumulate slowly in the body over time. Edmund, distracted by his wife's illness and his son's radical proposals, failed to notice the subtle changes in the household's power structure. He had always relied on Celeste's intelligence and discretion to help manage the complex relationships and competing interests that surrounded the plantation, and he naturally turned to her for advice and support as the crisis deepened. Celeste used her growing influence to begin systematically undermining William's reform efforts, spreading rumors, and creating obstacles that made his plans appear impractical and dangerous. She cultivated relationships with the plantation's overseers and the neighboring planters, positioning herself as a voice of reason and stability, in contrast to William's radical idealism. At the same time, Celeste began to prepare her own children for the roles they would play in the new order she was creating. Gabriel was trained in the management of the plantation's operations, while Marie was educated in the social graces and cultural knowledge that would allow her to move in elite circles despite her mixed heritage. Celeste understood that her children's survival depended not only on eliminating immediate threats, but also on positioning them to thrive in whatever society emerged from the chaos she was orchestrating. The transformation of Ashford Manor from a symbol of Southern aristocracy into a house of secrets and shadows was so gradual that most observers failed to recognize what was happening until it was too late. Visitors to the plantation began to comment on the strange atmosphere that seemed to permeate the great house, a sense of unease and foreboding that made even the most confident guests feel uncomfortable and unwelcome. The enslaved community on the plantation was the first to recognize the shift in power dynamics, and they responded with a mixture of fear and fascination. Celeste had always been a figure of mystery and respect among them, but her growing influence over the white family created new possibilities and new dangers that required careful navigation. Some saw her rise as an opportunity for advancement and protection, while others worried that her actions would bring down terrible retribution on the entire community. The relationship between Celeste and the other enslaved individuals on the plantation was complex and multifaceted. While some viewed her with suspicion and resentment because of her privileged position and her relationship with the master, others recognized her as a potential ally and protector who might be able to improve their conditions or even secure their freedom. Celeste was careful to maintain the delicate balance of these relationships, providing assistance and protection to those who supported her, while making it clear that opposition would not be tolerated. She used a combination of rewards and punishments to maintain discipline and loyalty within the enslaved community, always being careful to avoid actions that might attract unwanted attention from the white overseers or family members. As Catherine's health continued to deteriorate and William's reform efforts stalled, Edmund found himself increasingly isolated and dependent on Celeste's counsel. She had become his closest advisor and confidant, the one person who seemed to understand the complex pressures and competing demands that threatened to tear his family apart. But Edmund failed to recognize that Celeste's advice was carefully designed to advance her own agenda rather than preserve his family's interests. The final phase of Celeste's plan began in the autumn of 1841, when she started to introduce more potent substances into the food and drink consumed by the Ashford family. Her knowledge of herbs and natural compounds, combined with her access to the household's kitchen and dining areas, allowed her to administer carefully calculated doses of toxins that would produce the desired effects while avoiding detection by the family's physicians. The symptoms that began to appear among the family members were varied and seemingly unrelated, making it difficult for anyone to identify a common cause. Edmund began to suffer from severe headaches and periods of disorientation that affected his ability to make decisions and manage the plantation's affairs. William experienced episodes of weakness and nausea that forced him to abandon his reform efforts and focus on his own survival. Even the younger members of the family were not spared from Celeste's campaign. Edmund's daughter Margaret, who had always been suspicious of Celeste's influence over her father, began to suffer from mysterious ailments that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. The family's youngest son, Thomas, developed a persistent cough and fever that resisted all attempts at treatment. Margaret's suspicions about Celeste had been growing for months before she became ill. As an intelligent and observant young woman, she had noticed the subtle changes in the household's power dynamics and had begun to question the circumstances surrounding her stepmother's declining health. Margaret had attempted to voice her concerns to her father, but Edmund had dismissed her worries as the product of jealousy and feminine hysteria. The illness that eventually struck Margaret was particularly cruel, as it seemed to target the very qualities that had made her a threat to Celeste's plans. The toxins that Celeste administered to her gradually affected her cognitive abilities, making it difficult for her to think clearly or communicate effectively. This mental deterioration was accompanied by physical symptoms that left her weak and dependent on others for care. As the Ashford family's health declined, Celeste's position within the household became increasingly dominant. She took on the role of primary caregiver for the ailing family members, administering medications and treatments that appeared to provide temporary relief while actually ensuring the continuation of their suffering. Her apparent dedication to the family's welfare earned her the gratitude and trust of those she was systematically destroying. The physicians who were called to treat the Ashford family were baffled by the range and persistence of the symptoms they encountered. The medical knowledge of the era was insufficient to identify the sophisticated poisoning campaign that Celeste was conducting, and the doctors attributed the family's ailments to everything from bad air to divine punishment for the sins of slavery. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the family's primary physician, was particularly frustrated by his inability to provide effective treatment for his patients. He had studied at the finest medical schools in Europe and had built a reputation as one of the most skilled practitioners in the region, but the Ashford family's condition seemed to defy all conventional understanding of disease and treatment. Dr. Whitfield began to suspect that the family's ailments might have an environmental cause, and he conducted extensive investigations of the plantation's water sources, food supplies, and living conditions. But Celeste's methods were too subtle, and her knowledge too sophisticated for him to detect the true source of the problem. She had carefully studied the symptoms produced by various natural toxins and had developed a system of administration that mimicked the progression of natural diseases. The frustration and confusion experienced by Dr. Whitfield and his colleagues reflected the limitations of medical knowledge in the antebellum period. While physicians of the era were skilled in treating many common ailments and injuries, they lacked the scientific tools and understanding necessary to identify sophisticated poisoning campaigns. The concept of toxicology as a distinct medical discipline was still in its infancy, and most physicians had little knowledge of the effects of plant-based toxins or the ways in which they could be administered to produce specific symptoms. Celeste's superior knowledge in this area was the result of years of study and experimentation that had been conducted in secret, away from the prying eyes of those who might have questioned her activities. She had access to botanical and medical texts that were not available to most physicians of the era, and she had the time and opportunity to conduct careful experiments with various substances and combinations. As the months passed and the Ashford family's condition continued to worsen, rumors began to spread throughout the surrounding community about the strange curse that seemed to have fallen upon one of the region's most prominent families. Some attributed the family's misfortunes to divine retribution for their involvement in slavery, while others whispered about supernatural forces and ancient curses that had been awakened by the family's sins. The enslaved community on the plantation had their own theories about what was happening to the Ashford family, and many suspected that Celeste was somehow responsible for their master's decline. But the complex dynamics of plantation life made it impossible for anyone to speak openly about their suspicions, and those who might have been inclined to warn the family were deterred by their own precarious position and their fear of Celeste's power. The rumours and speculation that surrounded the Ashford family's mysterious ailments reflected the broader anxieties and tensions that characterized Southern society in the years leading up to the Civil War. The institution of slavery was under increasing attack from abolitionists in the North, and many Southerners were beginning to question whether their way of life could survive the moral and political challenges it faced. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, the idea that divine judgment might be falling upon one of the region's most prominent slaveholding families seemed plausible to many observers. The Ashfords had long been symbols of the wealth and power that slavery could provide, and their sudden decline was seen by some as evidence that the entire system was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Celeste herself maintained an appearance of concern and dedication that convinced even the most skeptical observers of her innocence. She worked tirelessly to care for the ailing family members, often staying up through the night to monitor their condition and administer treatments. Her apparent selflessness and devotion earned her the respect and admiration of the community's religious leaders and social reformers, who held her up as an example of Christian virtue and loyalty. But beneath the facade of the devoted caregiver, Celeste was carefully orchestrating the final phase of her plan. She had spent months positioning her own children to inherit the roles and responsibilities that the legitimate Ashford heirs were no longer able to fulfill. Gabriel had become indispensable to the plantation's daily operations, while Marie had established herself as the de facto mistress of the household's social functions. The transformation of the power structure at Ashford Manor was so complete that many visitors to the plantation began to assume that Gabriel and Marie were Edmund's legitimate children, their light skin and obvious education supporting the fiction that Celeste had carefully constructed. The true Ashford heirs were so weakened by their mysterious ailments that they were rarely seen in public, and their absence from social functions and business meetings was attributed to their poor health rather than their diminished status. Celeste's knowledge of poisons and their effects had been acquired through years of careful study and experimentation. She had access to an extensive library of medical and botanical texts that Edmund had collected over the years, and she had used this knowledge to develop an understanding of human physiology that rivaled that of trained physicians. Her experiments with various plants and compounds found on the plantation had taught her which substances could produce specific symptoms and how to combine them for maximum effect while minimizing the risk of detection. The garden that Celeste maintained behind the slave quarters served as both her laboratory and her pharmacy, containing dozens of plants and herbs that she had cultivated for their medicinal and toxic properties. To casual observers, it appeared to be simply a kitchen garden where she grew vegetables and herbs for cooking, but those who knew what to look for could identify species that had no culinary use and whose only purpose was to harm rather than heal. Among the plants in Celeste's garden were specimens that she had obtained through her network of contacts in New Orleans and other parts of Louisiana. Some of these species were native to the Caribbean and South America, brought to Louisiana by traders and travelers who were unaware of their dangerous properties. Others were common plants that grew wild in the bayous and forests of the region, but which Celeste had learned to cultivate and concentrate for maximum potency. The knowledge that allowed Celeste to identify and use these plants effectively came from a variety of sources. Some of it was traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations of enslaved people who had brought botanical expertise from Africa and the Caribbean. Other information came from medical and botanical texts that she had acquired through her network of contacts, including works by European physicians and natural philosophers who had studied the effects of various plant compounds on human physiology. Celeste's understanding of the human body and its vulnerabilities was enhanced by her intimate knowledge of each family member's individual weaknesses and susceptibilities. She knew that Catherine was prone to digestive problems and nervous conditions, that Edmund suffered from chronic headaches and high blood pressure, and that William had a weak constitution that made him particularly vulnerable to respiratory ailments. This knowledge allowed her to tailor her approach to each victim, using substances and methods that would exploit their specific vulnerabilities while appearing to be natural progressions of existing health problems. The timing of Celeste's campaign was carefully calculated to coincide with other stresses and pressures that were affecting the Ashford family. The political tensions surrounding William's abolitionist ideas, the economic pressures created by falling cotton prices, and the social strains caused by changing attitudes towards slavery all contributed to an atmosphere of crisis that made the family's declining health seem like just another manifestation of their overall misfortunes. Celeste also understood the importance of maintaining plausible deniability and ensuring that her actions could not be traced back to her. She varied the methods and timing of her attacks, sometimes using substances that produced immediate effects, and other times employing toxins that accumulated slowly in the body over weeks or months. This approach made it virtually impossible for anyone to establish a clear pattern or identify a specific cause for the family's ailments. The social dynamics of plantation life provided Celeste with additional protection from suspicion and investigation. The rigid racial hierarchy of the antebellum South made it almost unthinkable for white authorities to seriously consider the possibility that an enslaved woman could orchestrate such a sophisticated and successful campaign against her masters. Even when evidence pointed in her direction, it was dismissed or ignored by investigators, who could not conceive of an enslaved person possessing the intelligence and capability necessary to carry out such a complex plan. Celeste's position as a trusted household servant also gave her access to information and opportunities that would have been denied to other enslaved individuals. She was present during family meetings and private conversations, allowing her to gather intelligence about the family's plans and vulnerabilities. Her role in preparing and serving food gave her numerous opportunities to administer toxins without arousing suspicion, while her reputation as a healer and caregiver provided cover for her presence in the sick rooms of her victims. The psychological warfare that Celeste conducted alongside her physical attacks was equally sophisticated and effective. She used her intimate knowledge of each family member's fears and insecurities to create an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that weakened their ability to respond effectively to the threats they faced. She planted seeds of doubt about the loyalty of servants, the competence of physicians, and the motives of family members, creating divisions and conflicts that prevented the Ashfords from mounting a unified response to their crisis. The manipulation of family dynamics was one of Celeste's most subtle and effective weapons. She understood that the Ashford family, like many wealthy Southern families, was held together by a complex web of obligations, expectations, and unspoken agreements that could be disrupted by carefully applied pressure. By exploiting existing tensions and creating new sources of conflict, she was able to weaken the family's cohesion and make them more vulnerable to her attacks. One of the most effective techniques that Celeste employed was the strategic revelation of family secrets and scandals at moments when they would cause maximum damage. She had spent years collecting information about the indiscretions and failures of various family members, and she used this knowledge to create crises and distractions that diverted attention from her own activities while undermining the family's unity and morale. As 1841 drew to a close, the Ashford family that had once dominated the social and economic landscape of the region was little more than a shadow of its former self. Catherine had been confined to her bed for months, her mind clouded by the toxins that Celeste continued to administer under the guise of medical treatment. Edmund was barely able to manage the most basic aspects of the plantation's operations, relying entirely on Gabriel's assistance and Celeste's guidance. William, who had once threatened to upend the entire system with his abolitionist ideals, was now too weak to leave his room, let alone challenge the established order. His dreams of freeing the enslaved and transforming the plantation into a model of progressive labor relations had been reduced to fevered fantasies that he shared with no one but his journal. The journal that William kept during his final months provides one of the few first-hand accounts of the Ashford family's decline from the perspective of one of its victims. The entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand as his condition deteriorated, reveal a young man struggling to understand what was happening to him and his family, while clinging to his moral convictions despite his physical weakness. In his journal, William wrote about his suspicions that something unnatural was affecting his family, but he attributed their ailments to divine punishment for their involvement in slavery rather than to human agency. His religious upbringing and moral sensibilities made it difficult for him to conceive that one of the enslaved people he was trying to help might be responsible for his suffering. The younger Ashford children had fared no better, their promising futures dimmed by ailments that seemed to grow worse with each passing day. Margaret, who had once been considered one of the most eligible young women in the region, was now a pale shadow of her former self, her beauty faded and her spirit broken by months of suffering. Thomas, the youngest of the legitimate Ashford children, had been particularly affected by the toxins that Celeste administered to him. As a child, he was more vulnerable to the effects of the substances she used, and his condition deteriorated more rapidly than that of the adult family members. His illness was especially heartbreaking to observe, as he was too young to understand what was happening to him or why he was suffering. The final act of Celeste's elaborate revenge began on Christmas Eve of 1841, when she prepared a special feast for the Ashford family that would serve as both celebration and culmination of her long campaign. The meal was presented as a gesture of gratitude and devotion, a way for the enslaved community to show their appreciation for the family's benevolence and care. The dishes that Celeste prepared for the occasion were works of culinary art, featuring the finest ingredients and most sophisticated preparation techniques, but hidden within the elaborate sauces and delicate seasonings were concentrations of toxins that would ensure that this Christmas dinner would be the Ashford family's last. The preparation of this final meal required weeks of planning and careful coordination. Celeste had to ensure that the toxins she used would be potent enough to achieve their intended effect, while remaining undetectable to the family members who would consume them. She also had to consider the timing of the meal and the sequence in which the various dishes would be served to maximize the impact of her attack. The menu for the Christmas feast included traditional southern dishes that had been prepared for the Ashford family's holiday celebrations for generations. There was roasted turkey and ham, sweet potato casserole, cornbread dressing, and a variety of vegetables and side dishes that reflected the abundance of the plantation's agricultural production. For dessert, Celeste prepared elaborate cakes and pies that showcased her culinary skills, while concealing the deadly substances that would seal the family's fate. The family gathered in the grand dining room of Ashford Manor for what they believed would be a traditional holiday celebration. Despite their weakened condition, they made an effort to maintain the appearances and rituals that had defined their social position for generations. Edmund sat at the head of the table, with Catherine beside him, while their children arranged themselves according to the protocols of Southern aristocracy. The dining room itself was a monument to the Ashford family's wealth and status, with its crystal chandeliers, fine china, and silver serving pieces that had been passed down through generations. The walls were adorned with portraits of family ancestors and landscapes depicting the plantation's vast holdings, creating an atmosphere of tradition and permanence that belied the fragility of the family's actual situation. Celeste and her children served the meal with the same grace and efficiency that had characterized their service for years, but there was something different in their manner that night, a sense of anticipation and finality that suggested they understood the significance of the occasion in ways that their masters did not. As the family consumed the carefully prepared dishes, Celeste watched from the shadows of the dining room, her face betraying none of the satisfaction she felt as her long-planned revenge finally reached its conclusion. She had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment, studying her enemy's weaknesses and positioning herself to strike when they were most vulnerable. The effects of the final doses of toxin that Celeste had administered were swift and decisive. Within hours of the Christmas feast, the Ashford family was experiencing symptoms that even the most optimistic physician could not attribute to natural causes. The carefully calculated mixture of substances that Celeste had used created a cascade of physiological failures that overwhelmed the family's already weakened systems. The toxins that Celeste used in the final meal were derived from a combination of plants and compounds that she had been experimenting with for months. She had tested various combinations and dosages on small animals to determine the most effective mixture, and she had calculated the precise amounts needed to achieve the desired effect on each family member based on their individual body weights and health conditions. Dr. Whitfield was summoned to the plantation in the early hours of Christmas morning, but there was little he could do except watch as the family that had once seemed invincible succumbed to forces beyond his understanding. He documented the symptoms and progression of their condition with scientific precision, but he was unable to identify the cause or provide effective treatment. The physician's notes from that terrible night provide a clinical but haunting account of the Ashford family's final hours. Dr. Whitfield described the rapid onset of symptoms that included severe abdominal pain, respiratory distress, and neurological effects that left the family members confused and disoriented. Despite his best efforts to provide treatment, the toxins that Celeste had administered were too potent and too well designed to be counteracted by the medical knowledge available at the time. As news of the Ashford family's sudden decline spread throughout the region, speculation about the cause of their misfortune reached fever pitch. Some attributed their fate to divine judgment, while others suspected that they had fallen victim to some form of supernatural curse. A few whispered about the possibility of poisoning, but the idea that an enslaved woman could have orchestrated such an elaborate and successful campaign against one of the region's most powerful families seemed too fantastic to be credible. The investigation that followed the Ashford family's demise was hampered by the social and legal constraints of the antebellum South. The authorities were reluctant to seriously consider the possibility that an enslaved person could have been responsible for such a sophisticated crime, and the evidence that might have pointed to Celeste's involvement was either overlooked or dismissed as circumstantial. Sheriff James Morrison, who led the official investigation into the family's death, was a product of his time and place, with all the prejudices and assumptions that characterized white Southern society in the antebellum period. His investigation focused primarily on external threats, including the possibility that abolitionists or other enemies of the family might have been responsible for their demise. The idea that the perpetrator might be found within the household itself, particularly among the enslaved population, was considered only briefly and then dismissed as unlikely. The physical evidence that might have revealed the true cause of the family's death was either destroyed or misinterpreted by investigators who lacked the knowledge and tools necessary to identify sophisticated poisoning. The toxins that Celeste had used were derived from natural sources and broke down rapidly in the body, leaving few traces that could be detected by the crude analytical methods available at the time. Celeste herself maintained her role as the grieving and devoted servant, expressing appropriate sorrow at the loss of the family she had served for so many years. Her apparent loyalty and dedication made her an unlikely suspect in the eyes of investigators, who were predisposed to look for external threats rather than internal betrayal. The performance that Celeste gave during the investigation was perhaps her greatest triumph, as she managed to convince even the most skeptical observers of her innocence and devotion. She wept at appropriate moments, spoke eloquently about the family's kindness and generosity, and offered to assist the investigation in any way possible. Her apparent grief and shock at the family's sudden demise were so convincing that even those who might have harbored suspicions about her involvement were forced to reconsider their doubts. The legal proceedings that followed the family's death were complicated by questions about inheritance and succession that had never been adequately addressed during Edmund's lifetime. The existence of Celeste's children created ambiguities in the family's legal status that provided opportunities for manipulation and misdirection that she was uniquely positioned to exploit. Gabriel and Marie, who had been carefully prepared for this moment throughout their lives, stepped forward to claim their place as the rightful heirs to the Ashford legacy. Their light skin, obvious education, and intimate knowledge of the family's affairs made their claims difficult to dismiss, especially in the absence of clear legal documentation about their status. The legal arguments that supported Gabriel and Marie's claims to the Ashford inheritance were complex and carefully crafted, reflecting years of preparation and planning by Celeste. She had studied the laws governing inheritance and property rights in Louisiana, and she had identified loopholes and ambiguities that could be exploited to advance her children's interests. The documentation that supported these claims included carefully forged papers that established Gabriel and Marie's legal status as free persons of color, as well as evidence of their father's intention to provide for them in his will. While some of these documents were fabricated, others were genuine papers that Celeste had obtained through her network of contacts in the legal and business communities of New Orleans. The transformation of Celeste's children from enslaved property to wealthy landowners was accomplished through a combination of legal maneuvering, social manipulation, and the simple fact that there was no one left alive who could effectively challenge their claims. The community that had once looked down on them as the illegitimate offspring of a forbidden relationship now found itself forced to accept them as the legitimate inheritors of one of the region's great fortunes. The process of establishing Gabriel and Marie's legal status and securing their inheritance took several months, during which Celeste worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that all obstacles were removed and all challenges were defeated. She used her knowledge of the local legal system and her network of allies to navigate the complex process of probate and inheritance, while simultaneously managing the plantation's operations and maintaining the fiction of her own subordinate status. Celeste herself remained in the background during the transition, maintaining her role as a trusted advisor and confidant, while her children assumed the public roles and responsibilities that she had prepared them to fulfill. She had achieved her ultimate goal of securing her family's future and avenging the injustices that had been inflicted upon them, but she was wise enough to understand that her own survival depended on remaining invisible to those who might seek to challenge the new order. The story of what had really happened at Ashford Manor was known only to a few, and those who suspected the truth were either too frightened or too compromised to speak openly about their suspicions. Celeste had created a web of secrets and dependencies that ensured the silence of potential witnesses, while providing protection for herself and her children. The network of allies and accomplices that Celeste had cultivated over the years extended far beyond the boundaries of Ashford Manor. She had established relationships with free people of color in New Orleans, sympathetic white abolitionists, and even some members of the enslaved community on neighboring plantations who shared her goals of resistance and liberation. These connections provided her with resources, information, and protection that were essential to the success of her campaign. Among Celeste's most important allies was a free woman of color named Madame Laveau, who operated a network of informants and agents throughout Louisiana and the broader Gulf Coast region. Madame Laveau's organization provided Celeste with access to information about political and social developments that might affect her plans, as well as resources and assistance that were crucial to her success. The relationship between Celeste and Madame Laveau was based on mutual respect and shared goals, as both women understood the importance of challenging the system of oppression that sought to limit their opportunities and those of their children. While their methods differed, they were united in their determination to create a better future for themselves and their communities. Celeste's understanding of the legal and social systems that governed antebellum Louisiana was remarkably sophisticated, reflecting years of careful observation and study. She knew which laws could be exploited, which officials could be influenced, and which social conventions could be manipulated to advance her agenda. This knowledge allowed her to navigate the complex process of establishing her children's legal status and securing their inheritance with a skill that would have impressed trained lawyers. The documentation that supported Gabriel and Marie's claims to the Ashford inheritance was carefully crafted to appear authentic, while concealing the true circumstances of their parentage and legal status. Celeste had spent years preparing these documents, using her access to the family's papers and her understanding of legal procedures to create a paper trail that would withstand scrutiny from all but the most determined investigators. The transformation of Ashford Manor under the new management reflected Celeste's vision of what the plantation could become under different leadership. Gabriel implemented progressive labor practices that improved conditions for the remaining enslaved workers while maintaining the plantation's profitability. Marie established herself as a patron of the arts and education, using the family's wealth to support causes that would have been anathema to the original Ashford family. The success of Celeste's children in their new roles helped to legitimize their claims and silence potential critics who might have questioned their right to inherit the Ashford legacy. Their obvious competence and dedication to improving the plantation's operations made it difficult for anyone to argue that they were unworthy of their positions, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them to power. Gabriel's management of the plantation was marked by innovations and improvements that increased productivity while reducing the suffering of the enslaved workers. He introduced new agricultural techniques that he had learned through his education, implemented better housing and medical care for the workers, and established a system of incentives that rewarded productivity and good behavior. Marie's role as the social leader of the plantation was equally important to the family's success and legitimacy. She organized cultural events and educational programs that showcased the plantation's prosperity and refinement, while also providing opportunities for the enslaved community to develop their skills and talents. Her grace and intelligence made her a popular figure in New Orleans society, helping to establish the family's social credentials and political influence. As the years passed, and the memory of the original Ashford family faded, the official version of events became accepted as historical fact. The family's sudden demise was attributed to a combination of natural causes and unfortunate circumstances, while Celeste's children were remembered as loyal servants who had been rewarded for their devotion with freedom and inheritance. But among the enslaved community and the few white observers who had been close enough to witness the true dynamics of the household, a different story was told in whispers and coded conversations. They spoke of a woman who had used intelligence, patience, and intimate knowledge of her enemies to achieve a revenge so complete and so subtle that it had never been officially recognized or acknowledged. The legend of Celeste and her campaign against the Ashford family became part of the hidden history of the antebellum South, a story that revealed the complex power dynamics and moral contradictions that lay beneath the surface of Southern society. It was a tale that challenged comfortable assumptions about race, power, and justice, suggesting that even in a system designed to ensure the absolute subjugation of enslaved people, there were those who found ways to turn the tools of oppression against their oppressors. The Ashford Manor itself stood as a monument to Celeste's triumph, its grand rooms and elegant furnishings now serving the descendants of the woman who had once been counted among its property. The irony of the situation was not lost on those who understood the true history of the place, but the social conventions of the era made it impossible to acknowledge publicly what everyone privately knew. Celeste lived out her remaining years in comfort and security, surrounded by the children and grandchildren whose futures she had secured through her elaborate campaign of revenge. She never spoke openly about what she had done, but those who knew her well could see the satisfaction in her eyes when she looked upon the empire that her intelligence and determination had won. The methods that Celeste had used to achieve her goals were never fully documented or understood, taking with her to the grave the secrets of how she had managed to orchestrate such a complete and devastating victory over her former masters. Her knowledge of herbs, toxins, and human psychology died with her, leaving only the results of her work as testimony to her extraordinary abilities. The influence of Celeste's example extended far beyond the boundaries of Ashford Manor, inspiring other enslaved individuals throughout the region to consider new possibilities for resistance and liberation. Stories of her success spread through the underground networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across the South, providing hope and encouragement to those who had previously seen no escape from their circumstances. The impact of Celeste's actions on the broader abolitionist movement was significant but largely unrecognized at the time. Her demonstration that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and capability to challenge their oppressors in sophisticated ways helped to undermine the racist assumptions that justified the institution of slavery. However, the secretive nature of her campaign meant that her contributions to the cause of freedom were never publicly acknowledged or celebrated. The story of the Ashford family's destruction and Celeste's rise to power became a cautionary tale that was whispered among the enslaved communities throughout the South, a reminder that even the most powerful masters were not invulnerable to those who possessed the intelligence, patience, and determination to challenge their authority. It was a story that provided hope to some and terror to others, depending on which side of the power structure they occupied. Modern historians who have studied the fragmentary records of the Ashford family's demise have found tantalizing hints of the true story, but the deliberate obscurity that surrounded Celeste's actions and the social constraints that prevented honest investigation at the time have made it impossible to reconstruct the full details of what happened at Ashford Manor in 1841. What remains clear is that the official version of events bears little resemblance to the reality of what transpired within those walls, and that one of the most complete and sophisticated acts of revenge in American history was carried out by a woman whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions of the society that had enslaved her. The legacy of Celeste's triumph extends far beyond the specific events at Ashford Manor, serving as a reminder that the history of slavery in America contains stories of resistance, intelligence, and agency that have been systematically suppressed and forgotten. Her story reveals the complex ways in which enslaved people navigated and sometimes overcame the systems designed to control them, using weapons of wit and will that their oppressors never fully understood or appreciated. The darkest mansion story of the Old South was not one of supernatural horror or inexplicable tragedy, but rather the methodical and brilliant campaign of a woman who refused to accept the fate that society had assigned to her and her children. In the end, Celeste's victory was so complete that it erased itself from official history, leaving only whispers and legends to mark one of the most extraordinary reversals of fortune in the annals of American slavery. The white columns of Ashford Manor still stand today, weathered by time but unbroken, a testament to the enduring power of those who refuse to be defeated by the circumstances of their birth. And somewhere in the shadows of those grand rooms, the spirit of Celeste continues to remind us that justice, however delayed and however disguised, will always find a way to assert itself against the forces of oppression and injustice. The final chapter of Celeste's story was written not in the dramatic events of 1841, but in the quiet years that followed, as she watched her children and grandchildren build upon the foundation she had created through her sacrifice and determination. The empire she had won through intelligence and patience became a beacon of hope for future generations, proving that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overcome by those who possessed the courage to challenge them. In the end, the true measure of Celeste's victory was not the destruction of her enemies, but the creation of a legacy that would endure long after the last echoes of her story had faded into legend. She had transformed not only her own fate and that of her children, but had struck a blow against the entire system of slavery that would resonate through the generations, inspiring others to believe that freedom was not just a distant dream, but an achievable goal for those willing to fight for it with intelligence, patience, and unwavering determination. The story of Celeste and the Ashford family serves as a powerful reminder that history is written by the victors, but that sometimes the most important victories are those that remain hidden from public view. Her triumph was not celebrated in newspapers or commemorated with monuments, but it was no less significant for its secrecy. In fact, the very invisibility of her success was perhaps its greatest strength, allowing her legacy to survive and inspire future generations long after more public victories had been forgotten or distorted by the passage of time.